This presentation was recorded at the 2015 ANZICS ACCCN Annual Scientific Meeting.
So I'd like to introduce Alex Psirides. Alex is an intensive care specialist with me in Wellington. He's going to talk about social media and critical care, which is, I thought, what Neil's just done. So I'm not quite sure what you're going to talk about. He is a prolific tweeter, and I'll be interested to see whether he can tweet his own talk while he's delivering it. All yours, Alex.
Thanks, Peter. I actually did toy with the idea. You can actually now pre-schedule tweets at certain times. If you upload them to the website, they'll put them out. But I thought we'd probably overrun and my timing wouldn't be good enough. But you could actually listen to the talk on Twitter while I was giving it. But I hadn't done that. There's a big overlap between what Neil and I are talking about, mainly because we're both right. We did say, I think I sent an email to you about a month ago, so trying to make sure there wasn't too much. But we're going to overlap on the important things. Also, most of the questions that Neil's just dealt with is also a large part of my talk. So here goes. I've got some jokes in there just to try and make it a bit easier to go through. So what I'm going to talk about is SMICC, not SMACC. For those of you who don't know, SMACC is social media and critical care. They are a revolution within how junior medical staff and even senior medical staff and nurses and paramedics and pretty much every allied healthcare professional is being educated. Just as an example as to how predominant they are, the conference in Dublin went on sale 2 days ago. Within 5 hours, they'd sold 2,000 tickets. So they were completely sold out. There's a lot of people around trying to get registration who they now can't do. I realised a better title of this talk was actually See One, Do One, Tweet One, so that was after I'd already submitted the topic for the talk. This is roughly what I'm going to talk about. If you don't like any of this, you can leave at some point, but this is pretty much the next 20 minutes. So, what is social media? Who here doesn't have a Facebook account? Okay, so the vast majority of people use Facebook. Who here does have a Twitter account? Well, okay, so that's pretty balanced. I wasn't sure how much I'd have to explain. It's like giving a talk about hypertension and explaining what blood pressure is. You know, it's that kind of level of I wasn't sure what I'd have to tell you. So this is the Wikipedia page for social media. This is what it is. This is a huge, vast array of completely disparate things with one thing in common, which is that the content is written by the people who participate in it. It's not written by traditional media. The predominant paradigm, at least within social media in critical care, as several have said, is actually Twitter, because it has a variety of advantages over the other media. It's short, it's 140 characters long, and generally some people have said if you can't make your point in 140 characters, it's probably not worth reading. Now clearly that doesn't lend itself to an ongoing model of medical education. To look at the combination of the two, comparing what we call traditionally print-based, generally media, at least that's the one with the longest history with social media, you can see there's quite a marked variety of differences between them. Traditional media has always been few sources to many readers, whereas social media is many sources to many receivers. The key one that Neil also talked about was time, which is traditional media takes time. You have to go to school to be a journalist. You write what you think is the right thing, and then it's reviewed by your colleagues, and then it's eventually published after an editor's gone through it. Social media doesn't have that both handicap and advantage. Social media is immediate. You publish it as you think it, and it's not edited by anyone other than how fast you can type with your thumbs or fingers. Now, that's not always a good thing. One of the strengths of social media is the ability to adapt, but that's also one of its weaknesses, because you can change things afterwards. So, and I'll come talking a bit about post-publication peer review and why I think that's a strength of social media. So, again, because I'm going to having lots of pictures of tweets in this, I had to sort of start with the basic, what is a tweet and what are the various parts that you need to know about. For legal reasons, I have to state, as far as I know, Paris and Alex don't have a relationship and she's not endorsed this conference. But in terms of the way it works is you have a 140 character limit that you can use to put your message across. And the most important part, at least, is actually the hashtag, because it's a filter for the things that you think are important. Because you can search those hashtags that people have assigned. And FOMED, the predominant hashtag, is the one that you can use to guide yourself from the fire hose, as Sam beautifully put it, of social media to make sure that it doesn't blow your face off. Otherwise, you're just getting garbage. Not only that, but within them you can embed media. Although Twitter itself doesn't have photos, you can actually... Please don't take pictures of this. That's my career overview. Post that on Twitter. You can embed photos. So if there's things that can't be summarized in 140 characters, or there's things that you want to link to, that graphs, for example, infographics. For example, if you wanted, you could have a picture like this. Again, not officially endorsed by Paris Hilton, that you could use to make more serious points. And certainly within the medical components of FOMED, there's a large amount of stuff that gets infographic that people can easily digest. So You probably heard of the infinite monkey theorem, which is that if you take an infinite amount of chimpanzees, you lock them in a room with an infinite amount of typewriters, they'll eventually produce the works of Shakespeare. Now, the joy of Twitter is this essentially is what that is. What we've found is you've got an infinite number of people using an infinite number of smartphones, you've locked them in a room, and you've seen what they've come out with. And this is both the downside to Twitter, because, and I know I shouldn't pick on her, but this was what Lindsay Lohan tweeted immediately prior to Hurricane Sandy that killed 233 people and cost several billions dollars worth of damage. So this is the downside, and several people have said this is what the media focuses on. This is silly people saying silly things who would otherwise it would just be a conversation with a friend, but they're now putting it out to several million people. The upside of Twitter is that there are a large number of academics, and I'm putting Paul up there not only because Peter and I work with him, but he did something that was fairly unique recently. And when the split trial was published, is he actually did a live Twitter Q&A about the components of the split trial, and there were about 40, 50 people around the world who sent a continuous stream of questions that the first author of a JAMA paper answered in real time immediately after he presented it in Berlin. The metrics there for the hashtag that he made up, split trial, you can see there in terms of the number of tweets per hour that this generated. And I'll come to talk about this, and I know it's been raised a few times, people talking about translating research into practice. That's what this is, in a very good, powerful way. So, this was medical education 1902. You'll notice 3 women there. They're actually holding things for the men. So, gender equality in medicine. This was how we taught people 100 years ago. 112 years ago. We would put them all in a room and we'd watch people doing things. This is what lecture theatres look like now. For those of you who ever go to universities and see how medical students are being educated, the one thing, when I was looking at this morning, I realised that no one person is looking at the same thing on their laptop. So rather worryingly, they all seem to be on Facebook and Twitter, when in fact what they should be doing is paying attention to the teaching that's going on down the front. Someone there seems to be looking at family photos of the baby, but I use this illustratively, not actually literally. Foam as a concept was invented by one person, Mike Cadogan, at a conference in Dublin, an emergency medicine conference, where, so legend has it, and I've never met Mike, some of you may work with him, he's in WA I think, says that he sat down with a beer with Chris Nixon and they worked out between the two of them how they could bring together this increasing pool of people who were putting their knowledge and wisdom out on the internet for free. And what they came up with was exactly as Mike describes it there, a personalised, continually expanding database of resources for medical education, which happens to be linked through technology. That's all it is. It's nothing more than technology linking resources that everyone had lying around. And he wrote a paper, this was published last year, looking at the rise of these resources. And you can see it is and continues to be exponential. Where that will be in a few years, I have no idea. But whatever you think about it, you can't deny that it's real and that people are using it a lot. This is an analytic of the hashtag FOAMED for the year 2014. So there's something called Simpler that will aggregate hashtags for you and do data analytics on the hashtag that people put on tweets. If you can see that, there were 889 million impressions for FOAMED during that time that were generated from 191,000 tweets. This isn't something that's a niche market. There are large numbers of people doing this every day to transmit medical information around the world. And this is just a subset of many of the ones that people would be doing. This still astounds me, that however important we all think the New England Journal of Medicine is, that on a daily basis, Life in the Fast Lane, the probably preeminent free open access medical education journal, receives more page views than the New England Journal of Medicine does probably in a month. If you can't see the numbers on there, I can't because I've made it very small. It's somewhere around about 75,000 page views per day from all around the world because it's free. So this isn't here for a bet, this is here for something that we should need to look for in terms of how technology is taken up by people. There was a fascinating Twitter debate that I watched from afar, talking about how pornographers are, for better or for worse, incredible innovators, and that every new technology that comes along is immediately followed by someone in pornography working out how they're going to make money from it. Apparently the time from Caxton coming up with the first printing press in the 1400s to the first smutty woodcut publication was about 12 years. This is true, this isn't me making this up. And every great technological information, every great communication innovation that's followed therein, from newspapers to home video recording to 8mm film to internet, has been shortly followed by pornographers working out how they can actually use this as a communication tool. to the point that there's an incredible statistic that in the 1980s, supposedly something like 4% of American homes had VCR recorders, but 80% of them were predominantly for pornographic purposes. Now, I'm not saying we should emulate this on a whole variety of reasons. What I am saying is that in terms of technology innovation, pornographers seem to know where the next big thing is coming from because they make money from it. Now, I think the statistic for when the first website came out, within 3 months there was a pornographic variation. So, in terms of innovation, at least, in terms of product adoption and how quickly things are taken up, this is the one that marketers use to tell you about. This comes all the way back from 1946. In the 1930s in Iowa, they bred a new type of corn, and it was introduced in an interesting fashion. They gave it to some farmers who they considered influential, and they then watched how the uptake of this corn spread through other farmers in the area. So you've probably seen this before. Marketers love this graph with regard to the early adopters and the laggards at the other end. So someone, and again, part of the weakness of Twitter is I don't know who did this initially. I've just copied it from someone I saw from someone else. But they put this in terms of a medical education cycle and how far things have moved forward. So if you see new research, the innovators are the people who are blogging about it, putting it on Twitter and putting it in podcasts. What then happens a year down the track, you go to a conference and you'll hear people here today talking about things that they're doing, their research that they're publishing or they're working on. By the time you've finished your trial, 2-3 years down the track, it makes it into the journal. You then wait another few years till it makes it into the textbook that we're all told we must read, although by this time it's already 5 years too old. And then on the end you've got the laggards who don't care, don't read the books, are always going to do what they're always going to do because they know they're right. They don't need evidence to change their mind. This is a recent award that's been given to Damien Rowland, who's based in Leicester, and Jesse Spur, who's an Australian, looking at the FOMED conversation with regard to whether this is actually an educational community. And they did a similar thing to the graph I showed you earlier. They looked at the hashtag analysis over a 2-year period for FOMED and found that there are on average 17 tweets per hour. But what they found was that it meets the definition of educational community because people are actually talking to each other all the way around the outside of the Twitter accounts. And you can see that people are talking across each other. This, they argue, is no different to a faculty of a university or any other educational community. And there's a great quote by a Russian sociologist who talks about social constructivism, which is a theory of knowledge where groups construct knowledge for one another, and you're collaboratively creating this culture of education. And they believe in their paper, as does this sociologist, that this is actually what FOMED is. It's a valuable resource within that context. There's a paper from earlier this year that looked at what do our trainees, the people that we're working with, actually use FOMED for. And they asked a group of residents in Canada, and they compared that with a group of program directors. What they found was that residents actually stated the entertainment value was the most important in the choice as to what resources they used, which probably undoubtedly worries some academics. It means they need more jokes in their lectures. But it also means that if it's not entertaining, they're not interested in listening to it. So how do you convey, as educators, information to people that is inherently boring? I don't know. I'm not a professional educator. There may be people who have answers to those questions. But what they did find, and that's at the bottom, is that both groups, both the program directors who use social media and the residents, reported that online resources significantly increased the amount of peer-reviewed literature that they read. And some of the questions and concerns here about don't you just read Twitter, why don't you read the papers, in this case would appear to be not. It's actually inviting them to expand their sphere of knowledge and go looking elsewhere. So one of the downsides to that is if you're learning a large number of your procedures on Twitter, is that this probably isn't the way to go about it. So this is from Tony Brown. Some of you may know him. He's an eminent Australian emergency medicine physician. He's written a textbook, so we have to listen to what he says because he knows what he's talking about. He gave, of all things, ironically, a podcast in which he talked completely about how peer review is broken. He's the editor of a major binational journal. And those are his quotes, not mine. He points out 500,000 papers are published per year. That's greater than 1 per minute. In the time I've been going, there's 10 papers there that you haven't read. He says that authors and publishers benefit from journal publication, but no one else does. In the old days, you published because you had to register what it was that you were doing so people could learn about it. So the effect was more to do with the people receiving. It's now the publishers, i.e. the people who you pay to read their journals, and the kudos for the authors that's more important. He also says that most papers are rubbish, and as the author, as the editor of a journal, that greatly concerned him. People are publishing because they're publishing, not because what they have to say. And as we know, full text access is actually restricted in many cases. So 2 most recent examples. And there's a great website called Retraction Watch, which lists the number of retractions by author. The 2 most recent offenders, unfortunately, are both anaesthetists. One arguably hasn't done much harm, but this guy, according to the BMJ, they reckon he's contributed somewhere between 300 to 400 deaths per year, because almost single-handedly, despite going through the entire peer review process, he published what turned out to be a whole variety of fraudulent trials on the safety around synthetic colloids, which we now know from chest and various other things are probably very bad for you. So he has had an incredible amount of articles retracted, and he's been sacked from his academic position. All these were peer-reviewed through journals, but the crown goes to a Japanese colleague who essentially just made up some data and consistently did so. He's been forced to resign from his position, and several journals have published exposés on him and journalists as well. So the reason I'm putting these up is not to bag anaesthetists, because that would be bad as an intensivist. It's to say that simply the peer review process is not flaw-free, and it's not flawless, as is often it's put to be when people talk about the flaws of social media. Not only that, Nature, which is, you know, preeminent scientific journal ranked #1 everywhere, also has its problems. They've had to retract papers that they have been through rigorous peer review, and their comment alone in several of these articles where people were actually allowed to peer review their own article through a variety of fraudulent email addresses suggests that the peer review process may be broken. So the question I wanted to ask is, can free open access medical education actually help peer review? And what it requires is a kind of fundamental shift in terms of how you think. Rather than doing pre-publication peer review, you move to post-publication peer review. Now, it doesn't mean you put out garbage. It means that you have some pre-peer review, but you then allow people post-publication to comment on what it is that they've read, which then brings experts around it. So there's a variety of reasons why foam may be good. It's free, it's multinational, it's completely transparent, it's gender unbiased, as we've just heard, although it would seem the female dominance in this conference, at least on Twitter, may not be so. It's relatively robust, and it's apolitical. And the biggest, I know this is a bit meta, putting up a Wikipedia page about the reliability of Wikipedia, but Wikipedia, as has been shown in several studies where they compare the accuracy of articles in Wikipedia, is the ultimate in post-publication peer review. Mistakes on Wikipedia generally don't last more than 5 to 10 minutes because 50 people get into a fury and they bash out the right version until they can put it out there. Now, there's a suggestion that maybe, and it's my suggestion, is that maybe this would be a valid means by which we can review literature as well. Now, something that's really important, not just the coffee, but the filter. You can't use social media without having adequate filters, and there's 2 types of filters you need to use. This was my favourite tweet I've ever seen. This is the internet in a nutshell. It's actually from Mad Max, but basically it's just men yelling indistinctly. You need to be able to filter others if you're going to engage in social media. You need to not expose your mouth to the hosepipe of nonsense that comes out at you. You need to know what to filter. And there's a variety of ways you can do that. You can use hashtags, you can use curated lists, or you can just follow people you know that share similar interests. The other thing you also need to do is to filter yourself, because what you shouldn't be doing is sit there at 3 o'clock in the morning picking pointless arguments with someone on the other side of the planet who clearly doesn't know what you're talking about, and you do. So you do need to learn to rein yourself back in on occasion, and I certainly have had to do that sometimes. So moving on to translating research into practice, as I said, this has come up a few times in various other talks around the place. Again, I come back to Split, not just because I'm a co-author on it, but also because I think Paul did a fantastic job in terms of how he was going to do this. You may or may not be aware that several journals have embraced what are called alt metrics that Neil alluded to earlier, that don't just look at the number of times your paper is cited. When you only could have a journal that was paper distributed and you published in higher impact journals because more people read it, so you assume more people read your paper, the only way you could measure whether a paper was any good was how many times other people cited it. Now, that no longer applies because Adobe invented something called the PDF. And the PDF is a file that liberates the paper from the journal. But not only that, you can now have a metric that entirely reports on that PDF. So you can see here on the JAMA page, this was from last night, I refreshed it, 26,000 people have viewed that PDF. That's not 26,000 citations, that's just 26,000 people have read it. If you click on the little alt metrics button that they have on the JAMA website, it takes you to this, which is a breakdown of how the media, which includes social media, have reported on the paper. And you can see the number of times it's been on Twitter, the number of people, how the people around the world have responded to it, where people from Twitter have posted links to. You can see the number of times it's been on blogs, it's been in conventional media, it's been in Google media. And all this is collated as a single source, and they use some complicated metric to work out that number. So the higher the rated the number, the more the paper is being talked about, discussed, and downloaded and read. Now you can argue, is that a better metric than citations? Probably not. But this paper now is only, 3 weeks old, as opposed to the citation index, which won't start to pick up till 6 months or years down the track when people have done the studies that they can subsequently cite this paper for. Crash 2 is a great example. Crash 2 was a fairly revolutionary paper insofar as it was investigator-initiated. It didn't come with a drug that the drug company had a large amount of money in. It's a cheap drug that's freely available. And they specifically looked at a social media strategy around how they would popularize what they'd found rather than just relying on other people to do it. This is from the lead author. He says, what we're trying to do is get science to find the truth, and we must use art to remember the truth. So this is a beautiful translating research into practice statement. But what they did was really novel. They hired a graphic artist to come up with a comic book that had characters in it after a major disaster in a British emergency department where they encouraged them to use tranexamic acid, and they discussed the statistics and the numbers needed to treat in a form that most people could read and understand. They printed something like 1,000 copies of these books, and they distributed them to the emergency departments all the way around the country. Not only did they do that, the lead author wrote a song that he got his local gospel choir to sing. This is real, I'm not making this up, which is Won't You Stop My Bleeding, Give Tranexamic Acid. It's a great song, you can find it on YouTube, I recommend you listen to it. But the best one, this is my favourite, was his nephew is an animator, so he got him to make a stop-motion animation video to be distributed through social media to sell tranexamic acid to people.
Systolic 100. Systolic 90. Get me blood. A clot stabilizer given within 3 hours of injury reduces the risk of bleeding to death by 30%. Check out the Crash 2 trial.
Now, what a great way to sell your product to people. Again, this didn't have drug company backing. This was something that was investigator-initiated, that they believed was important enough to distribute through unconventional means, i.e. through social media. So this caused a bit of controversy, as you can probably imagine. There were social media advocates who were strongly in favour of it and made the point that actually, if we read a paper and we believe it's important and we don't have a drug company with a multi-million/billion-dollar marketing budget, then we should be selling this intervention ourselves. Simon Carley is an EM physician in the UK. He runs a very influential blog. He's an academic who is also involved in social media and came out and nailed his flag to the mast pretty early on by saying, seriously, you need to use this, it's great. Now, this understandably upset some of the detractors who complained that they didn't have a fair platform to oppose it. But of course they do, because they just get on Twitter and argue. And this is exactly what has happened. There's been a paper published since that actually looked at the means around how they promoted it, but also argued some of the scientific points as well. Now, arguing with Twitter people by writing a scientific paper is kind of missing the point. You should just get on Twitter and argue with them so they can argue back. But that's what they did. So, moving on from evidence-based medicine, or rather eminence-based medicine, to the cult of personality. I think this is probably a relatively good criticism of free open access medical education. There's no Iron Team, but there's certainly a me and FOMED. And the accusations are often made about the cult of personality, that these are individuals where their ability to convey information is outweighed, or so their ability to do that outweighs their academic prowess. Now, fortunately, some guy has come up with something called the Kardashian Index. This is a serious paper in which you can actually assess someone's ability. He drew a line of best fit through the number of citations versus number of Twitter followers, and you can work out on the line whether you're above or below it. I did mine, I come in just there. So I'm above the line, which worries me slightly, especially as I've picked up some more Twitter followers from this conference. I need to write more papers. But you can use some idea to work out whether the people you're listening to and reading about are actually valid and should be communicating information to you. This worries me. I'm not sure if you're going to do a resuscitative emergency thoracotomy or clamshell, you should be doing it based on an infographic that you saw on Twitter. This is something that I think our cardiac surgeons and most ED physicians would be quite distressed about. And I would hope that no one ever saw this, read it, put hand here this way to the aorta, and thought that this qualified them to go and do that. Now, this is reductive education. It's a strength, it's a graphic, it's a picture. But similarly, it does go to the see one, do one, tweet one, maybe a little bit too far. I realize I'm running over time, I apologise. I've only got a few more to go. This is another one where actually it turned out that social media was wrong. This is something called Nodset, which was nasal oxygenation during emergency securing of an airway tube, which came from a blog post that was written in America. And essentially it was the application of 15 litres per minute of nasal prong oxygen to prevent apneic oxygenation, to continue apneic oxygenation to prevent desaturation during intubation. And it spread like wildfire because it appeared on blogs, and you had things like this: great review, one of the most important airway articles ever published. I think that person probably hasn't read many articles on airways, I would respectfully suggest. What you then started seeing is pictures of things like this that people were making in their emergency departments by sticking oxygen tubes on laryngoscopes, and various hyperbolic statements such as doing rapid sequence induction with only one source of oxygen isn't acceptable anymore. Which led me to observe this, that your chance of doing it is probably directly related to the number of times you've read about it on Twitter. Now, what happened was conventional literature came to the rescue. They did an RCT, 150 patients randomized to either conventional laryngoscopic intubation or high-flow oxygen, and they found absolutely no difference. So this is turning it on its head. This is something that started in social media that subsequently was taken down by conventional media. And I like it because I think that's the way things should work. It's a two-way street. So this has come up several times from the questions I've heard in the audience. I didn't just write this slide just now. I wrote this some time ago. But this does worry me, that we've moved from the textbook to the chapter, to the paper, to the abstract, and now we're trying to summarize complex medical literature in 140 characters or less. But we have the capability to assess the credibility of the sources that we're looking at, and this is one of the papers that suggested how we do that. This isn't any different to how we assess conventional literature. We look at the author, we look at their biases, but it's just applying that tool to things in the social media spectrum where other sources may not be available. But this to me is like a duh moment. Of course, why wouldn't you do this? You wouldn't just believe someone you've never met before, you've no idea who they are, telling you how to put in a central line. So our professional bodies, understandably both nursing and medical, are all very upset by this, and they've published a series of flashing headlight danger signs saying these are things that you should and shouldn't do. I'm just going to go through a few of them quickly. They come out and said, be careful about what you say and how you say it. Now that's kind of pretty obvious. You wouldn't stand in the coffee queue at work talking openly about patients with names and details you wouldn't give anywhere else. The only difference, of course, is you have the ability to broadcast it to hundreds, thousands of people. The next one was consider the destiny of your data, and that's probably more important because everything you put out there you assume lives in perpetuity. You cannot delete things as much as you would like to think you can. Facebook has a very dodgy deletion policy. Twitter you can, but it still lives on their servers. This more relates to Facebook and befriending patients, any more than you wouldn't go out to dinner with patients if they invited you to. Don't become friends with them on Facebook. Don't necessarily interact with them on Twitter in a professional capacity. But also, you as individuals, to protect you, need to take control of your privacy, so there isn't information out there about you that you wouldn't want to fall into the wrong hands. So, in summary, this is what you need to succeed. You need to balance all these things, and this is no different to what you do in life in terms of how you manage your professional and personal responsibilities. I like the bit down the bottom about social intelligence and connecting with people, particularly with what Neil said about the happiness survey, that this does appear to make us happier. We have peers around us who reinforce our beliefs. Constant self-directed learning, adaptive mindset and critical thinking. I think those things are really important when it comes to considering social media sources. But to try and make a plea that social media isn't all bad. There is a dark side, but there's also a light side. I should stress this should be read horizontally, not vertically. I'm in no way suggesting that Katy Perry and Chris Nixon are the same person, although Paul may be a bit like Justin Bieber. But there are bad people who talk nonsense, and there are also eminent, clever people who you can engage on a one-to-one basis and have conversations with about their work. I've got 2 tweets to sum the whole thing up. I think this is really important when you read tweets. You need to realise it's the comment section without the context. If you think it's actually the context, then you don't understand social media and you shouldn't be using it, and you certainly shouldn't be using it in your professional life. On the upside, I think this is a great summary of what it is. It's the friend you always wished you could call at midnight to ask for help, because information is out there. It's available to you at the bedside. That's me done. Thank you very much for your time.